Where are people doing wonderful and good work to take care of this world? Who's telling the stories of people doing good, and who's catching people doing good and celebrating that? Those are things I wish we could pay more attention to.
And where do you see that, where people are like a church or any organization really, that it's doing good like what you're talking about? Because having examples like that are really, really helpful when we talk with people.
Well, let me share a quick story.
When life throws a challenge at you, one thing is certain: to find a resolution for every issue, every problem, for everybody, there's more than one way. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the More Than One Way podcast. I'm Whitney Ross, and with me, as always, is my good friend Thom Rasnick.
Hey, Whitney.
Hey, Thom, how you doing today?
Great today.
Good. We are so excited today. We have a special guest with us, Brian McLaren. Brian is a nationally known author, speaker, activist, public theologian, and podcaster with his show, Learning How to See. In addition to the many books he's written, he's also a core faculty member and dean of faculty at the Center for Action and Contemplation. We'll be sure to put a link in our show notes to his personal website so that you can access all of his amazing content. Brian, we are so glad to have you with us. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for inviting me. Great to be with you.
Well, Brian, we were just, one of the reasons that we started this podcast, as I told you in an email, is to try to have maybe a little bit of different voice than the majority Southern Christian voice here in good old Tennessee. And wanted just to pick your brain on some things that are going on in our world here. And so I'll let Whitney ask the first question, if you don't mind.
Given the availability of online resources and in-person seminars and books and courses and spirituality offerings, it almost seems like an individual could essentially create their own unique church or their own spiritual path in their own community, really. And with that kind of environment that we're currently in, what is the role of the church in that environment with people having so many options there?
Yes. Well, my goodness, that question makes me just think back 100 years ago, not only before the internet, but before cars, and not only before cars, but before books were so widely available through public libraries. And, you can see 150 years ago that when people were part of a church, it was really their only portal. It was kind of like their only internet site. It was their portal to learning. It was their portal to education. It was their portal to news and theological input and spiritual input and music and art. It was kind of their one portal. And when you think about what's happened over the last 100 years, portal after portal after portal has opened up. Mm-hmm. And so I think what this is going to, we could wish that spiritual leaders would have seen this 25, 50, 100 years ago and began to adapt. But it seems like we had enough momentum that we just kept going without noticing how much reality was changing. Mm. And so to me, it's going to mean, it means so much is different. But what I think it means very practically for churches is the churches have to say, well, what can we uniquely do? And it seems to me that churches can be uniquely local. They can actually pay attention to a local community. Sadly, a lot of our churches don't pay that much attention to their local community. They're preoccupied with denominational affairs that are national or global, or they're only focused on what's happening inside the church, and they don't think that much about what's happening in the community. But to me, to have a community of people who are thinking not only of the well-being of the members of their congregation, but of their town or their neighborhood or their part of town, or they're part of the state or whatever, that's a big deal. And to say that here's an organization that is concerned about the well-being, not only of our church members, but because of who we are as a church, we're concerned about the well-being of our community. That's a really big deal. I'll just mention two other dimensions of this. One is to have a church to say, hey, because we're situated, because we have an address, because we have a roof, the rain that falls on our roof goes into a stream. And that stream goes into another stream, and that goes into a river, and that river goes into a bay or an ocean. Now we are bound to everyone in our ecosystem because of this address. And so we're interested in helping people in this area care about this part of God's beautiful earth. So that kind of local rootedness, it seems to me, is a really, really big deal. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is, yeah, the internet can help us connect with people around the world instantly, as we're doing now. But to have somebody skin to skin, face to face, elbow to elbow, who's there for you, that is a really big deal. And paying attention to what the church can uniquely do with a local presence and an embodied presence, that seems to me to be really necessary for us to focus on going forward. Maybe I'll just add one other thing. Sorry to ramble on here, but it seems to me that people like yourselves, and when I was a pastor for 24 years, we who are clergy are called to serve in a particular location. We in some ways can be kind of curators of this flood of information that comes in through the internet and through cable news and through all these other channels. And it seems to me, part of our spiritual nurture for people is to take the role of curators, helping them sift through. Let's just face it. We know there's so much lies and misinformation and bigotry that get promoted. It seems to me part of our spiritual care as caregivers in a specific location now is to say, hey, look, we are people you trust. We are sifting through the information that's coming through. We want to help you sift through what's true and what's false, what's harmful and what's helpful. So those would be some, to me, the unique roles that a local congregation can play.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Thanks. Well, one of the things about that I experienced being a local pastor is just how busy people are. How their time is just so filled. And so what you're talking about, what have you found as like a really good way to kind of get people's attention, help them?
Yes.
One of the things that we talk about is like, how do we help you help yourself?
Yes. Oh, that's so well put. Well, look, let's take an old technology and then turn it into a new technology. An old technology is the church bell.
Yeah.
150, 200 years ago, people would ring a church bell. And it goes way back to the church bell would ring to call people to prayer.
Yeah.
So it might ring in the morning, at midday, at evening, at night. And it would be, people would hear that bell and it would be, oh, it's time to pray. And if I pause to pray now, I'm praying with all the members of my congregation, even though we're spread out. Well, it seems to me one of the things that it would make sense to us to do now, even though we're dispersed enough that no single church bell could get everybody's attention, people could get something in their email, in their inbox, or they could be part of a online network from a community. When I was a pastor, I didn't always write my sermons, but I often wrote my sermons. What would happen if I took that sermon and then broke it into 5 little paragraphs, and I sent out a paragraph, one on Monday, one on Tuesday, one on Wednesday? It would be a way for me to stay in touch with people. Or what if on Monday I sent the sermon, and on Tuesday we sent some prayer requests, and on Thursday we had somebody from the congregation tell their story. In other words, we could use new technologies to reach people where they are. In fact, I'm going to guess that a podcast like this is one example of doing that very thing. Now people can listen to this while they're driving to work, for example.
Right? Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. And it gives us a little bit more time to get into some things that, at least in the Episcopal Church, 10 minutes is a long sermon here, right? So,
Yes,
so
that's right. And this is a great advantage. You're exactly right.
Yeah.
This helps us do our work so much more effectively.
Right. Thank you.
I think one thing, given your experience and just your perspective, I would love to hear what are some things you think that we need to be paying more attention to that maybe we're not right now?
Well, I mean, in one sense, everybody's probably paying too much attention to this, but maybe we can help them pay attention in a different way. We know that we live in a divided country and in a divided world. Mm-hmm. And what ends up happening is a lot of clergy take what I call the walking on eggshells approach. Mm-hmm. They have to try to avoid offending anybody who listens to Fox News or who listens to, I don't know what the opposite would be, but there must be some opposite to Fox News out there.
MSNBC is probably going to be that.
Yeah, although, boy, those don't even seem truly opposite. But anyway, yeah. So you could take, MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, OAN, all these different things that people are listening to. And what many clergy feel they have to do then is, how can I give a sermon that won't offend anybody who's listening to one of those different news items? Mm-hmm. And that to me is a miserable way to live. In that way, it's, I don't know, that just feels like we're boxed into a very narrow lane of not being able to say things that really matter. So I think what we need to talk about is the fact that we live in a divided country, and that one of the only things everybody agrees with is that about half the population are really stupid. It's just that different halves think it's the other half that's stupid. And then to say, how are we going to live together in a situation like this? How are we going to discern what's true and what's not true? How are we going to venture out of our echo chambers? So I wish that we could help people more directly in that work. How can we invite people to humanize others when they're constantly being influenced by people who are dehumanizing others? Mm-hmm. And so that would be one thing. Another thing I mentioned earlier is there's not many people whose job it is to pay attention to the well-being of a local community, a local neighborhood. And if we could actually mobilize people to say, this is our town, this is our city, this is our state, and we're people who need to care about the common good here where we live. To me, that would be a wonderful thing. And then I'll tell you one other that I think could really help us. Episcopal churches are really wonderful at teaching people about the church year. But what if we also help people take more seriously the natural year, the passing of seasons, the reality of our own ecosystem, the struggles of climate change that we're facing? What species in our state or area are threatened or endangered? Where are people doing wonderful and good work to take care of this world? Who's telling the stories of people doing good, and who's catching people doing good and celebrating that? Those are things I wish we could pay more attention to.
Yeah. And where do you see that, where people are like a church or any organization really, that it's doing good like what you're talking about? Because having examples like that are really, really helpful when we talk with people.
Yes. Well, let me share a quick story. Back when I was a pastor in the Washington, D.C. area, and in my last few years there, we had a few different groups in the church basically take on an elementary school as part of their ministry. So there was a elementary school in a very underserved neighborhood right in Washington, D.C., but near where we lived in Maryland. We lived right near the D.C. border. And a group of men got to know, I can't remember if it was the principal or the vice principal, and they said, how could we be of help? And so they offered to paint the church, the school. The school was dirty and it was underfunded. And so a group of men from our church went in and painted the walls of the school, interior walls of the school, just to make it brighter and cleaner, more enjoyable for the teachers and students. Then someone from the school called me and they said, Pastor McLaren, we appreciate you coming to paint our school, so having men from your church do that. That was really nice. But can I tell you what would really help us? If you would go to the school board and tell them that you painted our school because we don't have enough money to paint our schools. And other schools are rolling in money, but schools in our neighborhood are underfunded. And he was speaking to a racial reality in our city. He said, people with your accent and your color of skin who show up at a school board meeting tend to get more attention than people with my accent and my color of skin. If you really want to help us, don't just paint our schools, show up at the school board and talk about why we have such dirty schools. And to me, there was this wonderful combination of people doing good by painting, but then finding out there's an even deeper way to get involved. And there are so many stories like that that can be told. And I think just on that theme of local schools, what would happen if a church said, let's pick every year, let's pick elementary school, a middle school, and a high school in our area. And every month, let's celebrate a great teacher, and let's celebrate a great administrator, and let's celebrate a great person who takes care of the physical facility, and let's celebrate the PTA leaders, and let's celebrate great students. And in fact, once I attended an Episcopal diocesan annual gathering. I was asked to speak at this diocesan gathering, and I was so impressed. This Episcopal diocese picked out great students from their county and invited them to the diocesan gathering at the church expense, and let them tell the story of the good things these students were doing. These were exemplary students who were doing wonderful volunteer work in the community. And I don't think they cared whether they were Episcopal or not. They just said, we're a church that's into people doing good, and you're doing good, and we want to celebrate you. Would you be our guest and share your story? And to me, it was just this beautiful example of a church being a celebrator of good news, which we're supposed to be about.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, because it is really helpful to be able to point to things and to people. And a lot of times talking about these more everything gets politicized today.
Yes.
It seems like, unfortunately, things that aren't intended to be political, unfortunately, get made political. And so in my experience here, it's the most helpful to talk about what we're talking about the way we're talking about it. Talk about it in groups, small groups, one-on-one in that world, because once you get up there to start preaching, it's almost like this is a whole nother method of communication that is such a monologue. It's hard to have any kind of give and take.
Yes, I think that's right. But and I think one of our great challenges for our churches in America, if I can be really, really frank, is that we have a history, and our history is full of injustice. Injustice toward the Native people, injustice toward the enslaved Africans, injustice toward Asian people who came here to work in various functions and then were stigmatized.
Women.
Injustice against women, against the LGBTQ community. We have so much of this history. And one of the characteristics of American religion is it managed to almost never address those injustices. It's this conspiracy of silence. We celebrate the abolitionists, but they were this tiny, tiny, tiny minority. And it seems to me one of the things that could happen is that clergy could say, let's tell the truth about our past, and let's try to behave better going forward. And let's look for a new way. And for a pastor to be able to say, it's my job. If all you ever hear is me avoiding any subject that upsets you, you can be sure I'm not doing my job. Part of my job is to upset you, but then it's your job to not just walk away mad or say, I'm never going to write another check again, but to say, we have to talk about this. I could be wrong. And let's have a needed conversation. Oh my goodness. I think if we could break that sound barrier, well, I worry about the future if we don't learn how to break that sound barrier.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And like I said, for me, the best place to break it is when there can be dialogue rather than
Exactly right. Yes. Yes.
It's almost as if kind of the setup of the church service and the Episcopal Church is real focused on the worship, but that setup is a wonderful for a lot of reception from the people sitting out there, receiving good music, participating in prayers, listening to sermon. All of it's real receiving oriented. And it's like what I get from what you're talking about is we need places where there's give and take, where you say something and I say something back, and we are able to, because we care about each other, say hard things. And it's almost like reframing the whole church service to be able to do that. I'm not really advocating for that for those of you who are listening and happen to go to St. John's. I'm not actually advocating for that, but I am saying it's worth a look. It's worth a look.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure.
And there are so many ways to do it. There's so many ways to do it if we decided that was really important.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that's a great thing for people to get talking about. That's right.
Right. Thanks. So here's something that's just a little, almost like a shift from what we're talking about a little bit, just into kind of talking about the larger framework of the Christian world that we're a part of here in the United States. And it's, what do you think of the prosperity gospel? How did that happen?
Oh my goodness. So many things in life. The first thing you have to say is, well, it's complicated.
Yeah.
And the prosperity gospel is an interesting case because I'll tell you a quick story about this. I was in the third poorest country in the world. It might be the third or fourth poorest now. Back then it was the third. It's the little country of Burundi in East Africa. And I was in a part of the capital city, Bujumbura, where there's hardly any it's probably a little better now, but 20 years ago when I was there were hardly any paved roads anywhere in the capital city, believe it or not. Wow. And I was with this woman, Burundian woman, visiting her at her home. And she and her husband had been leaders of a movement for reform in the country. There was a lot of corruption. There's a lot of violence. Everyone's heard of the genocide in Rwanda, but there was a parallel genocide in Burundi, and even more people were killed. It was just in about 5 genocides instead of 1. And she and her husband had been advocates for justice and peace and reconciliation. And then her husband was assassinated, just shot down on a street corner one day, probably by someone in the government who didn't like that he was pointing out the corruption. And she carried on with the work. And I was visiting her, and I asked her how she found the strength. And she said, this surprised me, but she said, well, it was through the prosperity gospel. And I said, what do you mean? She said, I grew up Catholic. She said, but I went to a Pentecostal church where they told us that God doesn't want us all to be poor. She said, before that, the priest told us that God wanted us all to be poor and that we would be rich in heaven. So we should just be satisfied with being poor now. But then the Pentecostal preacher told us that God wanted us to be rich. She said, but then we saw that he was the only one getting rich. She said, but that's what woke up my husband and me to say that maybe God doesn't want us all living in poverty. So, as with a lot of things, there's a grain of truth, and then things get abused. But you can imagine in America that what makes money for the preacher gets repeated often. And when preachers discovered that on radio and television, they could promise people that if you send me $50, God will bless you. If they broadcast that to 10,000 people and, 3 of them have some big financial windfall the following week after they write their big check, then they'll call the preacher and say, a miracle happened. I sent you money. They can keep repeating those stories, and the whole thing just becomes this self-reinforcing cycle. You can't do that so much when you're actually a pastor on the ground with a small congregation, because if they don't get the windfall that they're promised, then it's obvious. But so there are ways that these things just take on a life of their own. in the religious, what I sometimes call the religious industrial complex. But the grain of truth, I think, is that when we start to realize, you know what, God doesn't want everybody poor. God wants us to learn to have economic justice and economic generosity and sharing. I think that's an important message.
Yeah, it is an important message to say that this world matters, right? That
yes,
your
that's
life,
right.
your life here matters, and who you are matters, and that's a lovely thing. So I can see any message that has that piece. It's just the economic side tends to skew it a bit.
Yeah.
Oh, and the corruption is just staggering. Oh my goodness. These stories come out. It's staggering. And some of these preachers may just be crooks. They may just be people who think that the people they're preaching to are stupid and they can take advantage of them. I mean, they might really be vicious, some of them just vicious, craven people. But some of them maybe are very sincere and they get into it because they were inspired by somebody else, and one thing leads to another.
Yeah, thank you for that. Because sometimes I think, and when you look at life, sometimes you can be doing all the right things and be a kind person, loving, graceful, and life not go exactly the way you would hope it would go, especially oftentimes financially. And that doesn't mean that somehow or another God's not on your side.
That's right. That's right.
And I think people can fall into that sometimes. So thank you.
You, in your last response, you mentioned the what you call the religious industrial complex. Could you tell me a little bit more about that and kind of what you mean by that?
Sure. Well, look, Jesus, those of us who love and honor and respect Jesus, we have to pay attention to the fact that Jesus saw money as a real danger. I mean, he wasn't neutral about money. He said once, you will either love God and hate money, or hate money, or love money and hate God. And I mean, that's a pretty strong statement for Jesus to make. And I think what Jesus realizes is that money, that when we live in, and in some ways civilization only exists because of money. I mean, but what happens is financial systems affect our values. And the value of the civilization that we're part of, the society, the culture, the economy, teaches us how to value certain things. And we value it in terms of the money the system that we work in. And Jesus realized that the true value of things is not measured by money alone. So Jesus would tell stories about a homeless man who lived at the doorstep of a rich man. And in that rich man's eyes, that homeless, poor, sick man at his daughter, who, by the way, Jesus gave a name to. He said that he gave a name to the poor guy, Lazarus, and didn't give a name to the rich guy. It was his way of saying, look whose name matters here. Look who's important when I tell this story. Jesus would tell stories to try to shake people up and say, you're being blinded by money. You're valuing things wrongly because of the economic system you're part of. And so he proclaimed this thing he called the kingdom of God. I sometimes think we would be wiser to call it the economy of God, the alternative value system of God that helps us see things differently. But what always happens is that money wins. If we live around it long enough, it begins to get its talons into us and it changes our values. And so this is why I think one of the things I love about the Episcopal Church is every week we hear the gospel and we get a chance. Not too many weeks go by where we don't hear Jesus talk to us about what true value really is. And not only Jesus, but the biblical prophets had so much to say about this as well. But we just need to be aware that at any given moment, every individual, every family, every church or denomination or religion or nation is somewhere between having really good understandings of what has value or being totally bought in to what their economic system tells them has value. Does that help? Does that make sense?
That does. Thank you.
Yeah. And so much of Jesus' stuff, in my opinion, comes back to sight. Sight and hearing, and how am I seeing this? How am I experiencing this? And being honest with ourselves. To me, the rich guy and Lazarus, it's, can I be honest to myself that I didn't even see this guy?
Yeah.
I wasn't even paying any attention to him. And so that somehow or another my sight can be cleansed and I can see him as a human being, just as I can see other people and myself as a human being. That Jesus just
said, yes.
Yeah, he just seems to be all about that. So it's not the condemning those with money. It's the can you see in a different way? Mm-hmm. So
exactly. It's liberating us from the dehumanizing effects of money on ourselves and others. That's right. Exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. And like so much to me and within the spiritual world, it's paying attention. Paying close attention to myself. This is popping up. Take a look at this, and all these things that we're talking about, Brian, for me, start with me. I need to look at myself first, and with the lens of compassion, but also deep honesty, so that I can continue to grow. The way that we're talking about here, the way that you've seen in some of the churches and some of the places that are doing such good work in the world, that we can do that as individuals as well.
That's right. Amen.
Thank you. Thank you for saying amen. So what excites you about Christianity for the future? What looks good on the horizon in your world?
Well, here's a way I've been saying it lately. I think in the coming years, we will see uglier forms of Christianity than we've seen in a very long time. Maybe some of the ugliest forms we've ever seen. But the uglier that some of those forms of Christianity get, the more others of us will wake up and say, hey, we have to provide an alternative example to that. I was just preparing a talk this afternoon that I have to give tomorrow night, and about St. Francis. And St. Francis lived at a time where the church was, first of all, accumulating incredible amounts of wealth and gold and money. And then they were using a lot of that wealth to wage war against Muslims. And you put those two things together, it was not the best time for the church. And so St. Francis didn't just leave or give up or become cynical. He decided, I'm going to try to live in a truly Christ-like way. And I'm going to show the value of the poor and the sick. I'm going to show the value of animals and plants and forests. I'm going to put love up at the top and humility up at the top and generosity up at the top, rather than what kind of clothes you wear or how much status you have and so on. And so to me, I try to take encouragement not only for the beautiful things that people are doing, but even when I see these ugly things, it's my prayer and my hope and my belief that the uglier some things get, the more beautiful other people, the more beautiful things other people will do.
Oh, that's great. Let's go ahead.
So I love that perspective. I think that's so refreshing. And just thinking about all of the different things that you've been a part of, and you're speaking and as a podcast host and an author, is there anything you're currently working on now that you're excited about that you could share with us?
Well, I'll mention three things real quickly. Okay. One is, I think one of the toughest jobs in the entire world is to be a young parent. When you're a parent of young children, you have more demands on you. And often it's at a time when you're just working in your career, when you don't have a lot of money, at a time when in some ways you're doing your very most important work of your life. You're also under the most stress. And so a few years ago, a group of people came together, I was involved with it, to say, what can we do to help young parents? And so they're forming this collective called Raising Kids for Good. And what they're doing is they're saying we've got to help. We've got to go direct to parents, direct to children, and direct to churches so the churches can do a better job helping parents and children. And to me, that's it's super encouraging. And this little effort, I think there's 75 or 100 people who are writing children's books and who are developing curriculum for churches to use and who are developing podcasts to support parents. So it's just an example of a need that can really make a difference, because not only are you helping adult parents, but then you're helping children get a better start for their life in the future. Similarly, a group of us came together not too long ago to try to we have a lot of campus ministries. People in their college years are making some of the most important decisions in all their lives. And yet very often this is a time when they drift away from any kind of Christian fellowship. Mm-hmm. So we've been trying to form a collective of campus ministries that are helping students, and they might be Episcopal campus ministry or Methodist or Lutheran or whatever, but we're trying to help them say, hey, you can't just worry about people who are Lutheran or Episcopal. Let's think about creating open places of fellowship for students and help people on their spiritual journey. So it's been that, and that's called the Zoe on campus, ZOE on campus. It's been exciting to watch that evolve. And then I'll just mention one other. I'm on the board of advisors for something called Eco America and Blessed Tomorrow. And this is an organization that's helping churches take seriously our responsibility to care for the earth. And that's something that the Episcopal Church has really taken a beautiful role in. Presiding Bishop Michael Kerry has been such an example of calling people to care for creation. And so to me, we have so much more we can do, but it's great to see these good beginnings. And many congregations are really stepping up in this super important area.
Thank you so much. It's just been such a fascinating discussion, and we really appreciate your insight and just your commitment to really promoting that Christ-like way of interacting in the world. So thank you so much for spending the time with us, and we really appreciate you being a guest with us here on More Than One Way.
Well, thanks for hosting these kind of conversations in service to things that we all know have true and deep value. I'm honored to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the More Than One Way podcast, brought to you by the Center for Spiritual Practice in Knoxville, Tennessee. We really appreciate your time and would love to hear your feedback. You can reach us by emailing hello@morethanonewaypod.com, or you can connect with us on social media using the handle @morethanonewaypod. If you found this episode helpful, we hope that you'll share it with your friends, with your family, with people you work with all the people who you know. Thank you and take care.